where you start to develop a thing where you go like, I actually like this, but maybe you didn't like it at first, but you know it's good for you to do it that way. Is there anything in your life like that?
Well, learning.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sume McPhail. I'm the founder and CEO of WEquil School, a project-based, self-directed virtual learning platform. Our students present their projects every Saturday at 2 p.m. For more information, please go to wequil.school. This week's demo day is on psychology, and we have our guest speaker, Dr. Brandon Bergman, who has a PhD in psychology, an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, and associate director at the Recovery Research Institute. So the first project that we will be presenting today is my article on Intro to Psychology. So psychology is one of the fields that psychologists and scientists still don't know much about, even after a lot of research. And this is because the brain is so complicated. And out of all of the scientific practices, is probably one of the most complicated and diverse. In this article, I will be talking about what psychology is, and the three branches of psychology: structuralism, functionalism, and psychoanalysis. So all of these are just different approaches to studying psychology. So our brains are one of the most complicated things, and the field of psychology has been trying to answer questions like, do you have free will? What is consciousness? The modern definition of psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes, and is basically focused on understanding the human brain. It was only until the 16th century where psychology, the term, was established, but humans have always been pondering themselves and how their minds work. The first psychological exams were conducted by the Chinese 2,000 years ago. And in the 1800s, Muhammad Zakir al-Razi was the first to use the term mental illnesses and tried to treat it. So these are the three main approaches to psychology: structuralism, functionalism, and psychoanalysis. Structuralism is basically trying to break down psychology into structures, the same way you could you would break down an atom into photons, neutrons, and electrons. This was first created by a physician, Wilhelm Wundt. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, and basically he wanted people to look inwards and to try to break down what they felt doing something. And this made it so that it was rather subjective, and because different people can feel different things doing the same thing. And so William James, American psychologist, had a new way of studying psychology, which is functionalism, and it's why we feel the way we feel and why we think the way we think. And I think this is one thing that people can apply in their day-to-day lives, because you're thinking about, like, well, maybe someone did something, you're not quite sure why they did it, and you should be thinking about that, and not necessarily just write it off as irrational, and to try to really understand what's going on in their head. And this is basically, so it's you're thinking about why, and so it's called functionalism because it's more focused on the function of the brain. And William James published a book called The Principles of Psychology, and explained his definition of psychology of the science of mental life. And the last one, called psychoanalysis, was made by Sigmund Freud, and he started his own practice of psychology, mainly focusing on nervous disorders. And he had a moment where he witnessed a patient get treated for their disorder just by talking about their symptoms. And so he was thinking about that because he was wondering how that happened. And he he started trying to help his patients by letting them just talk about anything. And he called that to free associate. And so then he talked about in the 1900s, he published a book called The Interpretation of Dreams, and that explained psychoanalysis. And basically, psychoanalysis is not only just talking about whatever you want to talk about, but it was about the theory that our personalities, our behavior, the things that we think is mostly shaped by unconscious motives. And Freud also believed that even though you might not, your subconscious is below your conscious, you could still reach it by using things like dreams to have insights about how your brain is working and why you're thinking the things you're thinking. And so as I mentioned before, the modern definition of psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes. And it's kind of trying to integrate all of these three branches of psychology in different things like that. And so my second article is The Chemical Mind, and this is mostly talking about, I think I'm just going to present this one and then he can share his thoughts.
Go ahead and let him comment.
Sure. Okay.
Take
So
a break, make it a conversation.
yeah. So now our guest speaker can share his thoughts.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I wasn't sure if I was meant to interrupt because you were doing such a nice job presenting that overview. So, real quick, I just want to introduce myself. You introduced me with just kind of with a little more detail, and then I'll comment on the really nice history of psychology that you provided there. Thanks for having me. As you all mentioned, I'm Brandon Bergman. I'm Associate Director at the Recovery Research Institute at Mass General Hospital, an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, and I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist, which means I have a license to deliver psychotherapy services in the state of Massachusetts. It's a state-by-state thing. So, and just one thing I want to mention really quick, as just a disclaimer for folks in the audience, I am affiliated with all these organizations here. I'm here as a guest speaker and just a participant in the conversation with you all on my own behalf. I'm not representing any of the organizations. I'm not representing Mass General Hospital or Harvard Medical School, although I am very grateful to have affiliations with those institutes that allow me to get to do what I do, which I love to do. And so hopefully I'll be able to share some of those insights. With you all today. So, I mean, I think one, yeah. So, remind me of your first name again? Who just presented? Sume.
Yeah.
Sume, you really brought me back to the history of psychology. It's when we get our doctorates in clinical psychology, that provides like the foundation for everything that we do. Even if in my day-to-day, I'm not necessarily thinking about those sort of higher level constructs. Sigmund Freud, sure, in terms as a therapist, he was sort of in many ways the godfather of psychotherapy. But William James, oftentimes too, and sort of was one of the pioneers in thinking about really how to do research on psychological phenomena, psychological processes. So, and I was wondering if you had come across also at B.F. Skinner in any of the exploratory work that you were doing. If not, we could talk a little about.
No, I haven't heard of him.
Yeah, so you mentioned, in terms of the history, you talked about psychology being the study of the mind and behavior. So B.F. Skinner was among the first. He wasn't the first. William James was really like a kind of probably the first in sort of thinking about how to measure in tangible ways psychological phenomenon. I mean, William James is also a really interesting guy. He would study the intersection between psychology and religion also. Really interesting guy. But so B.F. Skinner is considered the father of behavioral psychology or behaviorism, which in many ways is I wouldn't say it's like the main psychology that informs what I do. I'm happy to answer questions, but it's one of them. And so I think you said something like, one of the questions they're answering is whether we as human beings have free will, right? Right. I mean, it's a really interesting question because it's hard for us to accept the fact, right, that we might not have free will, right? That there might be things in our environment that are influencing the ways that we think, feel, and act without us necessarily being aware of those influences. It could be a little bit unsettling, right? That we don't have control over everything. I mean, it is for me, anyways. So I don't know. What do you think about this idea of free will and whether we as human beings have free will or not? I don't know. Is it okay to have a discussion about this? I'm not sure. I don't want to. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I think I don't think I really. I mean, I have thought of it. It's sometimes where there are times when you think back on times, it's just like, was I really in complete control? And that was with the last branch. I think it's psychoanalysis, where there's ulterior subconscious motives in pretty much everything that you do, and you might not realize them. And to kind of, it's really interesting how all of them integrate, because I was thinking about like, well, you're trying to think about with psychoanalysis, it's like just thinking about the ulterior motives, and one way you could do that is by kind of looking inwards and to describe how you, and that's structuralism, and kind of looking at that as well. Yeah, it's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, and you're talking about how all the different theories of psychology fit together, and there are folks who talk about psychology and like theories in psychology as in some ways just sort of being, if it's like if you had blindfold on and there was an elephant in front of you, and depending on which part of the elephant you were near and you were touching, it would feel completely different, but it's the same animal, right? So that's a metaphor in terms of thinking about these different psychological theories as different ways of thinking about and describing and conceptualizing the same sort of phenomena, which is for us our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors as human beings, right? And they might have different words to describe it, which is the different theories that you're talking about. So I think that's where it gets really interesting in terms of looking at the theory. And I think the last thing I'll say, and I'll let you, I know there's you got a few different presentations, and I want to make sure to let you all get to them. No matter what psychological theory we're coming from. So I'm as I mentioned before, I'm a clinical psychologist. The vast majority of what I do is spent on in doing research. And the research that I do is mostly around helping people with substance use problems and other kinds of related problems. So oftentimes people experience anxiety or depression, and that comes along with the substance use. What I focus on, what I'm most interested in, is different and innovative ways of helping people do that. But I also am a psychotherapist. And those of us that do therapy, as psychologists or other kinds of mental health professionals, there's so many different ways of thinking about how to help people. One common sort of thread, I would say, right, through all of this, is this idea of coming back to this idea of free will, is whether we're talking about cognitive psychology or cognitive behavioral therapy, sometimes people say, which is a little bit more about like what's happening in the here and now and things of which people are aware, right? And then you mentioned psychoanalysis. Now, oftentimes what was sort of informed by psychoanalysis and Freudian psychoanalysis is now so it's often called psychodynamic psychology or psychodynamic psychotherapy. It's very similar, though. A lot of the Freudian principles inform that. Either which way, it's about helping people become aware of things that they weren't necessarily aware of before to help create choice for them, right? So it's this idea of B.F. Skinner, this behavioral psychologist, he said free will is an illusion. And what he meant by that was all the time there are these environmental influences around us, our friends, our family, social media as one example, other kinds of media, right, that are influencing our behavior in ways in which we're not aware, right? Now, Freudian psychoanalysts or psychodynamic psychologists would say, well, a lot of that influence is unconscious, right? Cognitive psychologists might say that influence is based on implicit cognition or cognition that we're not aware of. Different words describing very similar phenomena. But either which way, I think the last thing I'll say is, just to come back to your point, sort of tie together the theories of psychology with how we as clinical psychologists think about helping people, irrespective of the approach, a lot of what we do is helping people become more aware of things that are automatically happening, which allows them to gain awareness over the ways that their environment's influencing them, that they're acting on their environment, to give them choice to do things differently in the situations in which they have choice. Right, so it's an interesting that I'm glad you brought this idea of free will, because without us thinking about it, really does inform all the different kinds of work that we do.
Yeah. It's kind of like you can't really solve a problem without knowing what it is.
That's right. And I would say to that point, a big chunk of what we do as clinical psychologists, at least on the side of a psychotherapist, early on, is working with patients to help them identify what they want to be working on. Because it's not for us to say to the patient, here's what you should be working on. It's up to us to help them figure out, well, what is it they want to be working on? What is it that they're hoping to use the therapy to get out of life? What are they looking to change in their lives? And to be able to identify the problem in the ways that you're talking about, that's a big chunk of what we do as psychologists, especially early on in our work with patients.
Yeah. So the next presenter will be Antigone Stark, and she wrote an article on addiction and the brain.
Yeah, my article is on addiction and the brain. So in the past, addiction was really only thought to affect people who maybe didn't have self-control or weren't as moral as other people, but recently scientists have discovered that addiction actually makes changes to the brain by releasing dopamine and glutamate to make it really difficult for a person to stay abstinent. So addictive behaviors and substances affect the pleasure center, which is medically referred to as the nucleus accumbens, and it reacts to pleasurable stimuli by releasing dopamine, and dopamine tells the brain that the stimulus is worth getting more of, and then the brain will link that stimulus with pleasure, making the making the person want to get more of it. But when someone does drugs, the nucleus accumbens is actually flooded with dopamine, and the effects are intensified. So then they will go to greater lengths to get it. Another chemical that plays a role in addiction is known as glutamate, and glutamate plays a role in the continuation of life because it makes things like eating and drinking pleasurable for humans, so we repeat them and we survive. But addictive substances actually kind of hijack that system because they release glutamate, which makes the brain think that that substance is vital for life. And it forces the person to use the substance again. And this can lead to tolerance because as the brain is flooded with dopamine, it gets overwhelmed, and then it can stop producing as much, or it can eliminate dopamine receptors. But this leads the person the person wants to hit the ssame high, so they need to use more of the drugs, and then consequences can follow. The main point of this point of this article was to show how difficult it can be for a person to stop using addictive substances or engaging in addictive behaviors. And just saying no is really ineffective um, because it's just wired into your brain that you have to get more of that substance. And you should reach out to certified doctors and researchers to get help instead.
Great. It's a really nice overview of what's happening with in the brain with addiction. What do you all think of this idea? The article's gone, so forgive me if I kind of miss a word here or there, but you said something like, just say no approach, or treating addiction like a crime, or using a just say no approach is going to be ineffective because of the ways in which substance use is impacting the brain, and the brain is responding. In other words, there's a neurobiological basis for the addictive behaviors, which kind of, by definition, suggests that treating it as a criminal behavior and or a just say no approach is not gonna work. What do you all think of that idea? Because I mean, in the scope of like the history of addiction, that's a pretty novel idea. It's one that those of us that do the work we're on board with. So I don't want you to think that I'm challenging you here. But what do you think? It's for a long time, certainly through the 70s and 80s. That was the approach, and there are still big swaths of the country that see it this way, right? What do you all think of that idea of so if we're not going to treat it as a crime, and it's not a just say no approach, well then what? And then what do we do to help folks with substance use problems? What do you think?
I like the idea. I think it will lead people suffering from substance abuse disorders to find help, and that's something that they weren't doing in the past because it was so stigmatized.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point because we have data to suggest exactly what you're talking about. That, in particular, like sort of the opposite, where people that perceive this is more to do with alcohol use disorders, and we know a little bit less about other drug disorders. A lot, I'm sure, in this respect, I'm sure it's similar, where that the more people perceive stigma around them from friends, family, other people in their community, the more they perceive stigma with respect to substance use, the less likely they are to seek help for their substance use problem, right? So that the point that you're making, I think, is a really good one, where the corollary to that is that the degree to which we, as people in the community, right, can frame substance use disorders as a health condition, as health conditions, right, and as public health problems that have solutions, the more likely it is that people are willing to get help, which I think is the point that you were making. I think it's a really good one. Other thoughts?
I was just wondering if, like, when you like take like those drugs, are you aware of what's happening to you?
Meaning, like, aware of are you wondering if people are aware of the way in which the drugs are affecting them, or
Yeah.
aware of the ways it's changing your brain? I want to make sure I'm understanding the question right.
I'm wondering if like they know it'll change them, but are they like actually noticing how that's doing it?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think my best guess, just based on what I know about human beings, is it probably depends on the person. I think some people might have a greater sense of like what they're experiencing at any given moment, and how once they've consumed a substance, how their feelings change. I think some people might be more aware of that than others. I think one of the things I want to make sure to mention too is what makes substance use disorder so challenging, both for people that are experiencing it, right, and for those of us that are trying to help folks where the substance use is causing consequences in their life. And just to clarify, I think you probably heard me say substance use disorder. To define that in the time we have is essentially that someone's using a particular substance, whether that's alcohol, opioids, cannabis, so that's like marijuana, for example, right? They're using it. It's causing consequences for them in their life in lots of different, and usually in many different areas and over an extended period of time. And they continue to use it, right? So that's in a nutshell what substance use disorder means. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that's basically it. But what makes it so challenging is that the substance use for a big chunk of people, especially those with that develop disorders, it feels really good, right? So it's a potent and very predictable way to feel better in the moment. To sometimes to magnify the sort of good feelings, or for people that struggle with anxiety or depression, it's a way to help provide them with some relief, what we call negative so the first is positive reinforcement. This is true separate from substance use, right? If we do something and we like the way it feels, maybe it's like our favorite activity or our favorite food or our favorite songs, we're more likely to listen to it over and over again. So I don't know if you all are into music. I'm really into music. And sometimes I have like favorite bands or favorite songs, right? And especially the first time I hear it, I'll listen to it over and over and over again over the course of the next few months, right? That's positive reinforcement. We do something, we like the way it feels, we're going to do it more. Or we have friends that we like to hang out with. We're going to, yeah, go ahead. You have your hand raised. Go ahead.
So with like songs or like movies and stuff, there's diminishing marginal utility. Is there diminishing marginal utility with drugs?
Less so. And I think I know what you mean in terms of meaning that the more and more you listen to it or watch it, it doesn't produce the same sort of level of reward. I mean, that is true to the extent that the brain adjusts to the substance, which is, I think, what Antigone mentioned was this idea of tolerance. So the difference is there isn't much interpretation the brain has to do with a substance. It just, you consume the substance, the brain reacts the way it does. And it's very predictable. It's much more predictable than other forms of reward, which is one of the things that makes it challenging to stop, is because people know what's going to happen when they take the substance. And the reward that someone might get from their favorite food or their favorite song or whatever, for the I mean, I'm overgeneralizing, but multiply that by like a million, by like 1,000 times in terms of the way it feels. So it's much more powerful. But yes, there is diminishing marginal returns in as much as your brain, someone's brain will turn the volume down on the different kinds of neurotransmitters. So one of the classic examples is with a stimulant drug called cocaine. So cocaine impacts the dopamine, the dopaminergic system directly, and your brain. Yeah, it can be, and I want to make one more comment before I stop about this idea of a substance itself being addictive, because there's an interaction between our brains that we're born with that we have no control over and the substance itself. But the one thing I want to say is, so with cocaine, for example, especially if someone takes cocaine over an extended period of time, that directly impacts the dopaminergic system, right? So as our neurons communicate with one another, they're sending signals to each other, right, with different kinds of neurotransmitters. One of them is dopamine, which Antigone mentioned. What cocaine does is it sort of makes sure that all the dopamine that is communicating with the other neurons in the brain, it just keeps moving along very, very quickly. And so it produces a very sort of potent feeling of reward, right? But our brains go, whoa, this is way too much dopamine, way more than I'm used to. Because what I'm used to is the dopamine that comes from my favorite song or the people I like spending time with or my favorite food. And so the tolerance gets created when our brain basically turns down the volume on the dopamine by adjusting to the amount of dopamine in the brain. And so this idea of diminishing marginal returns, I think you were saying, in as much as we have less dopamine in our brain, we will be able to feel less reward over time from that same substance. That's called tolerance, which I think that's what you're getting at with diminishing marginal returns, yes?
Well, yeah.
And the last thing I'll say is this idea of like a substance being addictive, and you were talking about in this idea of addiction in the brain, the ways that the substance can impact the brain and that the brain adjusts to the substance. One of the more important things is that 40 to 60% of the essentially the likelihood of whether, because there are lots of people that take substances and don't develop substance disorders. In fact, the vast majority of people who take a substance, whether it's alcohol or some other kinds of substance that is not legal, right? 40 to 60% of that likelihood of whether someone is going to develop a substance use disorder, meaning they're going to take the substance and want to take more of it and have it cause problems for them and continue to take it. 40 to 60% of that likelihood comes from genetics. So it's got nothing. It's the brains with which people are born, and there's way more to it than that. But I think that's an important thing to distinguish. Is yes, there are substances themselves that sort of lend themselves to people potentially becoming addicted to them. But some people develop substance disorders and some people don't, and there are lots of things that explain that difference. But the biggest chunk of that, or one of the largest chunks of that, comes from genetics and the brains that we're born with and sort of in family history, and that people have no control over that, which comes back to, and then I'll stop talking, which comes back to Antigone's point about treating substance use disorder and addiction as a public health and as a health condition and a public health problem to be solved as opposed to a crime, because the vast majority of the struggles that people have with substance use disorder is based on their genetics and the brains with which they are born, right? And it's not about choice so much or a moral failing, which I think was your point, right? And it's really about helping people as best we can become aware of like, hey, this is a problem for you, and then providing them with as much help and support and service as we possibly can. So I think with that, I'll stop and let you guys move on with the presentation.
I understand.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Thank you for your thoughts.
Sure.
So Isla will be presenting her article on positive psychology.
So hello, my name is Isla and I am 9 years old. Today I will be talking about positive psychology. Part of my article is based on a talk that Tal Ben-Shahar, which is a leader in positive psychology, gave a talk on his book that he wrote on called Happier. Okay, so a few takeaways that I got from this talk was that the first one was permission to be human. And what he means by permission to be human is that it's okay to feel sad sometimes, and we need to give ourselves permission to feel these negative feelings. And feeling sad is proof that we are human. And so that's something that we should accept. The second one is dealing with stress. There are a few ways of dealing with stress. And one of them is having time to do things that you want to do and it's fun for you. And one thing you can keep in mind is that stress is not the problem. It is the lack of recovery. And two ways to recover that I think is very useful. The first one is meditation is one of the best things with dealing with stress. And there are so many ways to meditate, but one thing that they all have in common is that you're focusing on one thing. And so I gave more examples of that in my article. And the second one is to appreciate. I think appreciating is one way is to just say thank you. one way is to just say thank you. But there's also a second way, and it is to appreciate the good in your life. As simple as being grateful that there is clothes and food and a house that you can live in. And that will be a very positive, that can be a very positive change in how much happiness you have in your life. There's also a second leader in positive psychology that I mentioned in my article, other than Tal Ben-Shahar, and his name is Dan Gilbert. And in this video, he talks about the surprising science of happiness. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is regrets of the dying. I think the subject in my article is very powerful. And what I want to say about the regrets of the dying is first, to start out, people do things. It's like it's human to do things that we regret. But sometimes we don't notice it until we get too old and it's too late. And one thing that people that are dying said was that I finally feel like I am living. I finally feel like I am alive. And what they mean by that is that they are appreciating every single moment of their life. Because when you're younger, you're not really, I don't think a lot of people are thinking about like one day they're going to die, and one day they won't have just tomorrow to do what they want to do. And so when you notice that, which unfortunately a lot of people only notice it when they are about to die, you start appreciating every moment of your life. You start to feel grateful for what you feel more grateful for what you have. And so one story I might want to share is about my great aunt named Mary Alice. And when she once she got diagnosed with cancer, and she didn't know if she was going to make it, and that led her to thinking more about what she did in her life and her regrets. And so she actually did live on, and she was able to survive that disease. And so that made a dramatic change in her life, because she started to really be way more grateful and live in the moment, because she was able to remind herself when she got diagnosed with cancer. So the last thing I'm going to talk about for the rest of the dying is up a little bit, is the 5 most common regrets. The first one is that people say, I wish I had lived a life true to myself and not the life others expected of me. The second one is that I wish I had not worked so hard. And what they mean by that is not that they wish that they had been more lazy. It's that they wish they had worked less hard on things that were less important. The third one is I wish I had the courage to express my feelings. The fourth one is I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. And the third one is I wish I had let myself be more happy. A lot of people, I'm going to elaborate more on this because a lot of people don't really realize that they can be more happy and they can choose how happy they want to be. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is the hamburger model. So the hamburger model is to help us with making more decisions. And so in the hamburger model, there are 4 hamburgers. The first one is the tasty junk food burger. And this is about present benefit and future detriment. It is called the hedonism burger. And there is the second one is a tasteless and healthy burger. It is about future benefit and present detriment. And so you will not enjoy eating the hamburger, but it is still healthy for you. And the worst one of all is the tasteless and unhealthy burger, which is about present detriment and future detriment. It is called the nihilism burger. And the last one is the best one of all. It is tasty. It is the tasty and healthy burger. It is about present benefit and future benefit. It is called the happiness burger. Now, this model, this hamburger model is not only about hamburgers. It is about how happy, it is also about how happy we can be with the decisions we make. And no person lives only in one burger. There lives only in one burger. Everybody has a different days and makes different decisions that are in all different burgers. For example, of the hedonism, the tasty junk food burger, people might be eating a unhealthy burger, or they might be playing video games, or they might be watching one of their favorite movies that isn't very educational. For the rat race burger, the tasty but healthy burger, maybe you're studying for a test or finishing up a work project, and no human being can completely avoid sometimes making decisions that aren't in the nihilism burger. Maybe it's just like feeling bad, or you're just having one of those bad days. And in the happiness burger, maybe you're eating a favorite meal that is also healthy, or you're spending time with a friend. And I think the main point of this model is to help you make more decisions and do more things that are in the happiness burger. For conclusion, I have really enjoyed presenting my article that I wrote. I think writing this article and internalizing this, it has really helped me in my own life, and making decisions in my own life. And so I think positive psychology is a really great thing to understand, because you can change how happy you are by you can choose how happy you want to be and how happy you are. And so now Suma is going to pass it on to the next presenter.
Well, we can. Does Dr. Bergman have any thoughts for you?
I mean, you just you touched on so many interesting areas. I'm trying to. I have one comment and then a question. You got my brain going in so many different great directions. I love that presentation. So, I mean, it was about positive psychology, yes, but I think one of the things you also touched on, and we won't get into it too much, but it's a comment, is existential psychology, which is essentially about the idea of meaning making in our lives. How do we create meaning in our lives? What's meaningful to us? Finding something in terms of the people in our lives, or a hobby or a career, right? Something that helps create meaning for us. And there's all different sorts of ways to do that. But I think while you started on positive psychology, you also ended up talking about what we call existential psychology, which is the ways that we make meaning. One point, and then a question about the hamburger model. So one point tying together all these different things is, early on, you were talking about being thankful or grateful for the for what somebody has in their life, gratitude, and kind of thinking about these these elements of positive psychology. I love that. It's so important, because a lot of what we do as health professionals, clinical psychologists, physicians, other kinds of health professionals, we're very good at identifying what's not going well in somebody's life and helping them stabilize or make it a little bit better so that they can function better, sort of get back integrated with their social lives and so on, right? We're really quite good at that, but there's limitations to that. That only gets people so far. What you're talking about is how to help people go from that to figuring out, what are they grateful for? What hope do they have in their lives? What meaning do they have in their lives? That's the kind of thing that helps people sustain change in their life over the long term, which is where positive psychology comes into the fold. And so this idea of addiction of the brain, we were talking about dopamine. One really interesting study you guys might like to know about is, you take, this has been done in monkeys, so a lot of this has been done in animals, not yet with humans. But if you put monkeys in an environment that doesn't have much going on, right? There aren't many sort of monkeys around them, so they don't have friends to spend time with and hang out with. This has also been done in rats. You see a greater likelihood or propensity to develop an addiction. It's in a laboratory with animals, so it's a little bit different than how it looks in humans. But But then when you put them in an enriching social environment, right, you see an ability to, first of all, E2 receptors, which are dopamine receptors, right? Those just naturally increase. So what that means is there's this natural ability for people to feel rewards from social environment and whatnot. So what that tells us is it's not just as simple as the brain and a substance, but it's also about, to your presentation, what brings us joy in our lives, right? Who are we spending our time with? What kinds of activities are we involved with? That kind of thing can make a big difference in terms of protecting against the sort of possibility of developing addiction. Yeah, go ahead. You have a question.
I was just wondering, like, the thought you made on, like, how you get more, like, if you are, like, tested on monkeys, and if they don't have much going on, and if they don't have any, like, friends to hang out with, then they are more likely to develop an addiction.
Yep.
And is that kind of related to, like, if you are like stuck in the house or something, like COVID-19, for example, in quarantine, and you're, like, stuck in the house and you haven't been able to see as many people, are you, like, more likely to, like, get a more positive effect from seeing people?
For the most part, yes. I mean, it's a really important question. I think what you're wondering about is what are the negative effects of social isolation on human beings. And we've seen, although we're still learning about what's happening during COVID-19, both to kids, teenagers, young adults, and adults. But one of the things we've seen for sure with adults, I know, is that we've seen rates of alcohol and other drug use increase, right, in a very concerning way. So I think in general there is a negative impact of social isolation on mental health, and I think that's what you're wondering about. So yes, that's and the reverse, and sort of thinking about it from the other perspective, I think is also important, where for most people, right? Obviously, I don't want to speak in generalizations because not everything is true for everybody. As my mentor always says, if we're asking a question about whether this particular treatment works, the answer is always yes for some, meaning that not everything is going to work for everybody, right? But all that said, for most of us, having enriching social environments, finding things that we love doing, people we like spending time with, that can help protect against, right, developing problems. And for people that develop mental health problems, it can be a helpful part of their recovery, right? So now I wanted to just I wanted to come back and ask a question to everybody about this hamburger model. So one of the things that this really brings out, there's a field of psychology. It's fairly new, but it's very popular right now. It's called behavioral economics. And if you're interested in the hamburger model, I would Google behavioral economics and learn more about it. You would really enjoy it. But it's about the idea that we as people are constantly responding to incentives in our environment. And one of the constructs, right, one of the themes in behavioral economics is this idea of delayed discounting. What does that mean? Well, that means that, and this is true for lots of people that struggle with different kinds of mental health challenges, they tend to discount good things that might happen later and focus on the good things or good feelings that are going to happen now or in the short term, right?
Hedonism burger.
Yes, exactly. So and again, I think I was talking about the idea of genetics. We think for the most part that this is something that people are born with, where it's just this tendency that some people have to focus on the rewards that they're going to get in the short term, and they discount or they don't think as much about the rewards they're going to get later on. So is there anything in your guys' life that you do that you don't really like doing necessarily? It's not like fun, you don't enjoy it, but
Brushing.
you know, what is it?
Brushing teeth.
Okay, so why do you brush? That's a good right. So you don't like to brush your teeth, but why do you do it?
Because I don't want to have bad teeth.
Right.
And
Yep. Go ahead.
and I think it's kind of like the rat race. No, it doesn't. It's the rat race burger where you will have a good impact on your life in the long term, even if it's not your favorite thing to do right now.
Yeah, right. You're 100% right in terms of the different burgers. The rat race is that burger, and what you're doing is you actually have you are you are able to have the proper value essentially for the later reward. You're thinking about, well, and the flip side of not wanting to sort of have consequences with your teeth is you can think about it from the positive, using positive psychology, that you want to have nice and healthy teeth, right? As you know, throughout your life. So now I also want you guys to think about this. Are there any activities that you didn't used to like to do, right? That might have been like the rat race, right? Where they don't feel very good, but you know it's going to be good for you in the long run, so you do it. But at some point over time, you start to like it. It starts to feel good because you kind of know down the road, oh, this is going to be good for me, right? And then over time, and this might not be true for everything, but is there anything like that in your life where you start to develop a thing where you go like, I actually like this, but maybe you didn't like it at first, but you know it's good for you, you do it that way. Is there anything in your life like that?
Well, learning.
Okay. Well, say more about that. Why is learning? So, I mean, what we're talking about here is how the rat race burger can become the happiness burger, right? So how did learning go from being like the rat race burger to the happiness burger for you?
Well, for me, I used to think that learning was just like this bad thing that was boring. But the more I did it, the more I realized that learning is like actually really like it's actually kind of fun when you're doing it and you're learning about things that you are interested in. So this also applies to the philosophy of WEquil School. So that's something I noticed with learning is that when I was learning about like things like, well, positive psychology, it kind of clicked for me at one point, and I was just like, this is really interesting. So I don't know if that applies that much and if that's applied, but that's just something that came to mind.
Yeah, it's also with when you're learning at first you don't know many things, so you're learning about a bunch of different things and you don't really know how it connects, but then as you kind of have this more of just a plot of the world and what you know about it, you can learn new things, and then it's like, well, this relates to this, which relates to this, and then it becomes more you're learning things, but you're learning things in context as well. And it's funny that you would, it's behavioral economics because our last demo day was economics. So
yeah, I mean, and that it's about how the principles of economics applies to human behavior. Yeah. So I mean, what you guys are talking about is so cool, but it's about how thinking about learning and what it gives you and the joy it brings you, right? And part of what helps that happen for you is by making connections between all the different areas, right? And putting everything in context, I think was what you were talking about. Yeah.
Also, like when we were having the conversation earlier in the demo day, you were saying like this addiction like for a majority of people, it's kind of like their genes. And then I was kind of like trying to answer the question in my head, can genome editing fix that? Because I was learning about genomics with my sister, and she was teaching me about genomics. And so I feel like that's one example that I thought was really cool that I was able to.
Totally. Yeah. That's the kind of that makes it right. And that made it fun for you by making that connection.
Yeah.
Antigone has to go.
Okay, and that also relates to what?
Well, it relates to just having all these different connections. Now
Yeah,
that makes
yeah.
things more interesting.
Yeah.
What it reminded me of also is like the idea of learning. So I'm a musician, kind of, sort of. I've been playing drums my whole life, and I play the piano, although very badly. But people that grow to love playing a musical instrument, for example, or practicing a sport, or practicing any kind of skill.
Piano.
It's piano. It's a really good example where, like, at first practicing might not feel so good, and maybe it doesn't, and maybe for some people it doesn't ever feel good, right? But you practice for a reason, because you like the way it feels to be able to play a song, or right, and to put everything together. And I think one of the coolest things about something like learning an instrument, especially with the practices, over time, what starts out as the rat race burger, right, can become the happiness burger, where your brain starts to make this connection between the experience of practicing and the thing you love about playing the instrument. And then something just happens over time in the brain, where your brain starts to make this connection between the practice and the stuff you like about it, the performance, let's say. And you grow to like the practice, the process of it too, right? And that's really where things become, whether it's learning or what have you, like that becomes joyful. Talk about positive psychology, where you love the process. And what happens in the end and the outcome, no matter how it goes, you can be okay with it, right? Because you love the process of it. In this case, you're talking about we were talking about, the process of learning an instrument, the process of learning, putting together this idea of how does genomics, right, or gene editing fit in with the disease, or the brain neurobiological pieces of addiction, right? You love that process, right? That's going from rat race to the happiness burger right there.
Yeah.
And one thing is, like, that's something we'll mention to WEquil School students, is like, you like the things that you're good at. So then you shouldn't really be thinking about, what do I like to do right now? You should be thinking about, what do I want to like? What do I want to be interested in the future, that if I put in the work now, it'll be really fun for me, and it'll also be really beneficial to me as well.
Yeah,
You like the things that you're good at, and you do and to get good at things, you do them. So just do a bunch of stuff that you want to like.
Yeah.
So that's just like something that was really amazing for me when I figured that out. And
that's good. That's good for all of us to be keeping it. It's good for all of us to be keeping in mind, right? Is really tapping into what makes us happy, right? Now, I'm noticing the time, so I don't know if I need to stop talking. Would you let me? You let me know.
We can just do my presentation, then after that, Anya has her presentation.
All right, so why don't I stop talking so I can let you guys present?
It's really interesting. So my second article is on the chemical mind, and is about like the chemicals and neurons in your brain. And so one thing that some people think is like psychology is separate from biology, but that's not true, because the psychology of neurons and how your brain works and how you interpret things, it's all part of your biology. And so studying the chemicals in your body and how that affects your perception of the world can give you insights into how your brain is working, and why you're thinking the things you're thinking, and things like that. So and so how to begin studying that is neurons, and also known as nerve cells. And basically neurons are basically made up built like any other cell, except they have electrical chemicals that can make electrical signals to communicate with other neurons. And that in our brain it has billions of neurons, and they the size of a neuron can be very different, from less than a millimeter long to ones as long as your leg. So the neurons has all the same parts of a cell, and it has the cell body, dendrites, and the axon. And Then the cell body is basically just all the things that the neuron needs to live, and the dendrites are things sticking out of the neurons to receive other neurons' electrical signals, and the axon creates electrical signals from that neurons, and neurons are either triggered if some other neuron says something to them, or if they get sensory input like what they see or what they hear. And so there are over 100 different types of neurons, and so there are different types of neurons. I think it's excitatory neurons, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, increases the probability that you're going to take action or the neuron will take action, and then inhibitory neurons will do the opposite and decrease the probability that it will take action. And so there's also neurons, but then there's also the endocrine system, and neurotransmitters are very fast, but the endocrine system takes longer for chemical communications. And so neurotransmitters take less time, but you're more likely to remember transmissions from the endocrine system. So basically with the chemical mind, the takeaway from this article is that it's more of the biology side of psychology, where there's like what in Isla's article is more talking about kind of theories of how people are happy, but then there's also the biology aspect of it. So the last presentation we will be sharing is Anya on talking to kids.
Hi, my name is Anya Rollison. I am 12 years old and I am a student at WEquil School. WEquil School is coming out with a new in-depth series and TV show about talking to kids. We want to cover all bases because this is a very touchy and emotional subject. It's about the best way that kids and adults can communicate and how to avoid certain things. And we are looking for potentially interested families. And if you are interested, you can join our WEquil School Facebook group, or you can join our private group on rethinking education.
Thank you, Anya. So thank you so much, Dr. Bergman, for joining us. This has been amazing. And thank you, Anya and Antigone, for joining us. So we have the next week's demo day is entrepreneurship, and we'll have some guest speakers who have started their own businesses and some WEquil School students who are thinking about and have already started their own startups. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.